Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Being quarantined at home doesn't mean safety for everyone. As globally, more than 3 billion people are put under lockdown, human rights experts fear the rise in domestic abuse across the world. Let's take a deeper look at what this means and what individuals living in toxic households and with abusive partners potentially can do to protect themselves. Joining us for this conversation is Professor Cary, who is a professor of psychology and health. He joins us from Manchester. Also joining us is Jenny Helms, a licensed marriage and family therapist, joining us from Kansas, and Ms. Fauzia Waqar, who's the chairperson of the Punjab Commission for Women's Rights. She joins us from Islamabad. Thank you all for joining us, and a very warm welcome to the show. Ms. Fauzia Waqar, I'd like to begin with you. Now, having this conversation about domestic violence, domestic abuse is difficult at any point in the year. But now, given the circumstances, it becomes even more difficult. How can you help those that are surviving in these toxic environments? Where do we begin to understand the complexity of this problem?
Yes, thank you, Meshal. I think you're touching on a very, very important subject because whenever there is a global crisis or of the kind that we are faced with now, like this pandemic, women tend to get neglected in the various aspects of their life. We've had reports generally across the globe that domestic violence has increased during lockdown periods, here also in Pakistan, but certainly globally. We've also seen that there is a direct impact on the health of women, especially their reproductive health, where their access to, for instance, pregnancy-related checkups is reduced considerably. Their needs are put on the back burner to be able to deal with the more urgent need of the pandemic. So in this case, we see that in terms of domestic violence, women in Pakistan are they are bound to experience increased domestic violence because of two factors. One, being locked, as a matter of fact, more than two factors. One is being locked in the home with children to care for, with a husband who is now locked down and who is stressed because of financial problems and also because of the lockdown situation, is bound to take it out on the woman. You know, even when they are not locked down and there is not an awful lot of financial stress, it is still considered the man's prerogative to beat up the woman, as we have seen in the demographic and health survey. Now, in such situation, we will see a drastic rise, which will be perpetuated by the fact that the police is working on a reduced schedule. You know, there is lesser police force. Women's access to the safety mechanisms has been reduced considerably. So we need to do something about it to make sure that those women who have become victims of abuse, or women who are vulnerable to greater abuse, they are heard. The services to these women is not disrupted, and there are alternate mechanisms to ensure that their needs are addressed.
Ms. Waqar, now you mentioned here most the inevitable violence that is going to come and fall on these women who have been trapped in their homes with partners who were previously abusive, but now given the anxiety surrounding that will be amplified. And you are saying that mechanisms need to be put in place, but with COVID-19 and the enormity of it, how it has disrupted, how can we realistically work towards getting those mechanisms in place which help protect these women, or at least help give them access to certain basic facilities?
Sure. I think since we are now in the second month of this pandemic, our responses have become a little more refined. The complexity of the situation is being taken into perspective. We know that this pandemic is, even though it is impacting the rich along with the poor, still the implications for the poor who have lesser food security, who have complete income insecurity, they are going to be impacted more. This is about reminding the world that the different impacts on women have to be taken into consideration. Yes, we have to deal with the pandemic, but we also have to deal with the related issues. You know, earlier on, when there was the 2005 earthquake, we saw a distinct rise in abuse against women in the house and outside the house. When globally there was an Ebola outbreak, we saw that there was a drastic increase in the number of domestic and sexual violence cases. Even recently in the Hubei province, in China, saw that the domestic violence cases reported tripled in February compared to the same time last year. So we know that this is happening. Now, what do we do? One, yes, the police has to be made more sensitive to this problem. Secondly, maybe online mechanisms of reporting violence, maybe a more effective through telephone reporting mechanism, which can then be taken seriously, and punitive measures for people who are engaging in such a behavior that could be tied with economic sanctions. People are receiving relief packages. If there are reports from their homes, then maybe do not give the money, the relief money that is being given to the male of the house, send it directly to the woman's account, or give it directly to disperse it directly to the woman. So these are, some slight this is initial thinking on how the issue can be addressed from the perspective of women.
Ms. Waqar, now digging deep into these measures you've stated, as I mentioned before, this is a very complex issue even prior to when we weren't in the midst of a pandemic. Reporting domestic abuse was already difficult, trying it was already difficult, but now given that these women will be locked down, and the measures are just that more difficult to get a hold of, to actually go through with. Do you feel like there can be other alternatives, such as setups where these women can find refuge? Do you think that's a viable option?
There are. We are switching to different mechanisms. This entire Tiger Force, which is being visualized, which was going to go from household to household to make sure that people who are most vulnerable are being taken care of, because these are not just women, these are not just the elderly, these are people with disabilities also. Similarly, these forces can certainly be sensitized to this issue. Just today, I had a phone call from a woman in the south of Punjab saying she's suffering from violence, she has absolutely no voice, and now she feels like she's left more alone because the police has no focus on women's domestic abuse. So we have to raise this issue at a policy level. We have to raise this issue at an intervention level. And once the government diverts attention to it, sure, it will not get the kind of attention that we need, or maybe we won't see mechanisms immediately, but at least there's going to be sensitization and there's going to be some response rather than pushing it completely under the rug.
And how do we get to that point, creating massive awareness and creating sensitization to the issue? Because we seem like we're so much far away from this conversation. It's slipping into the cracks basically right now about all these women that are vulnerable, especially within their own homes.
Well, you're already doing that through your program. Media has to definitely dedicate more attention to it. The policy forums which are being constituted to provide relief measures, the various relief packages which are being discussed, they need to understand the vulnerability of women, because it's not just domestic abuse. Women have been rendered jobless, and yet they are counted nowhere, because 70% of the women in Pakistan are working as home-based workers without a formal contract, working on piece rate in an extremely exploitative situation.
Right.
Those women count nowhere. They are not among the daily wagers who are going to be given the relief that we're talking about. Finding those women, raising their issues, etc., that is important. The care work that women are doing, women are suffering from double burden now, because they're home, they're taking care of their children who are no longer in school, they are also taking care of the sick.
Right, all those duties that women, all that unpaid labor, everything that was a gendered issue before this pandemic is now just amplified even more so. Thank you so much, Ms. Fauzia Waqar, for joining us and giving us your insight. Jenny, jumping to you now, I want to make this conversation about people who aren't just suffering from domestic abuse, but also from psychological abuse and other forms of anxieties within the household. We do know many households are toxic, not just because there's abuse from one partner, but because there is a dysfunctional dynamic within it. How do you think couples can, given the anxieties, work towards being a little more healthy and conscientious for themselves and especially for the children?
I think there are certain things in place where we have to take care of ourselves and have differentiation where we have boundaries with our partner if they're unwilling to do the work we need to do to have good, healthy, safe communication. But in general, what we understand about couples as far as decreasing anxiety when it comes to having to talk about very stressful topics, which a lot of couples are right now in family systems, the biggest important factor is that they start with what we call a soft startup, which is trying to start conversations in a way that is very kind, has a good tone of voice. If you can add humor into conversations, that's always ideal as well. But when it comes to emotional abuse, sometimes that doesn't necessarily work. And I think the biggest take home for anybody who's struggling in a relationship right now or a family system that's not healthy is that, you know, when we're talking to ourselves about this, that we understand that it's not our fault. It's not because we're not inherently worthy or beautiful or because we don't have enough money, that, you know, domestic violence and emotional abuse can happen to any person, that you're not alone. And I think the biggest resource is if you can find ways to connect with anybody that is safe and emotionally healthy, right, to reach out and to connect to those resources in a way that's safe. I know that's going to look different for each person depending on the resources they have and the options they have. And doing safety planning with something online like loveisrespect.org, depending on your specific situation.
Right. Jenny, that's an important thing you bring up, that it's differently for different people, how they're going to cope with the anxieties and stresses. Professor Cooper, this is where I want your expertise to shed more light on this. Given that people cannot step out of their homes, cannot find other distractions, cannot find an escape of sorts, and they're trapped in a situation which is very highly stressful, how can they deal with their anxieties better? Are there ways, are there tactics that normally you would suggest to people and can be somehow switched around a little to fit the situation right now?
Well, I think what a lot of families are doing, for example, in Europe at the moment, is they're trying to think about and prioritize their day. There's a lot of pressure. We know that the police are not going to be as vigilant when it comes to this issue because they have so many other issues to deal with. And the same thing with social services, incidentally. Although I think most countries should have a hotline directly to social services where they then link up with the police, because we do need a hotline of some sort. But within the context of the family, what I think is really important is, because I think there's going to be not in just dysfunctional families, but in ordinary families who normally aren't together very much, there's going to be much more pressure, probably more violence, anger, frustration, etc. Because this is going to go on for months. This is not something that's just a few weeks. These are going to go on for months. So I think if families can get themselves together at the beginning to plan their day, to prioritize things, who's going to do what, who's going to be working from where, because remember, people are still working from their home. So we have that as well. The underlying stress of financial worry, and even in ordinary, what looks like a perfectly functioning family is going to be under more stress than ever before. For the dysfunctional family, I'm not sure what you can do, because that dysfunctionality has been there a long time. I'm not sure what you can do except to stay away from your partner and use some kind of hotline directly to social services or the police. But I'm kind of worried, as a preventive measure, what's going to happen to a large number of people who before didn't appear to be dysfunctional, but now may have problems being forced together, feeling job insecure, financially insecure,
a lot of other Right. A lot of other factors will be playing to how family dynamics evolve during this situation. Jenny, now you, of course, work with couples, you work with families, counseling them. How do you think conversations, you mentioned one of the ways in which conversations can begin and how they should move on, but how can there be conflict resolution in a more systematic or organized, or at least in a more sensitive way, given the situation? Are there ways that you can recommend families can move towards resolving conflicts and issues?
You know, it's kind of sounds counterintuitive, but I would recommend that families focus on really self-regulation and dealing with their own anxiety, so that when they're coming to other family members, they are the calm and non-anxious presence. Because as much as we'd like to control our family members or get everybody on the same page, we can't 100% control that. I mean, we can kind of create a schedule, we can create boundaries, the parents can create boundaries, but to have some grace during this time, that not everybody's going to be on the same page about everything, and that's okay, you know, and to take some deep breaths and just realize that, you know, the biggest important issue is that people feel heard and they feel understood. And obviously in issues of safety or something bigger, there does have to be distinct boundaries. However, when it just comes to having to try to get the kids to do certain things, to not try to engage in this all-out war during this time, create structure where you can, but realize that at the end of the day, we have to set an example for other family members and be self-regulated to really be in a space to communicate effectively and resolve issues.
Jenny, that's a really important point about the focus on self-regulating your behavior, trying to work towards greater functionality, trying to work towards greater peace within the household. Thank you so much, Jenny Helms, for joining us and talking to us about this. Professor Cary Cooper, now a lot of the questions that have been coming up from many people on social media, many people reaching out, have been regarding their specific anxiety and panic attacks, people with already underlying mental health issues and how those are being aggravated right now. What can a person do if they are in that situation where they feel like they are starting to suffer from frequent anxiety and panic attacks? I know this is a very helpless situation, but what can those individuals do?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the COVID anxiety levels are astronomical and will grow the longer we're kind of forced into our homes and without really. So I don't even like the concept of social distancing. It shouldn't even be called that. It's physically distancing, but actually we need social connectedness. So from my point of view, how you can reduce the anxiety levels is use the technology to contact your friends, your family, do it every day. In other words, we have WhatsApp, we have FaceTime, we have Zoom, we have so many technologies that would enable us to link in socially with our family and friends, because you need to talk about your anxieties, you need to talk about what your fears are with people that you love. Being with your grandchildren, being with your children, contacting them on a regular basis. Incidentally, the family should be doing that anyway, with elderly, with their grandparents. But we do need the social connectedness. In fact, we don't need social distancing. We need to get closer together using the technology to do that. Because I think that's the way anxious, stressed people will be able to cope with this crisis.
Right. Professor Cary Cooper, amongst the suggestions that have been being given online, and especially for abuse victims, especially for those who are undergoing physical abuse at this point in time, is recording and documenting the abuse, keeping a journal of some form. Do you feel like that is something you would recommend as well?
Yes, I would. I mean, in many countries now, I think they're thinking about how we're going to deal with this issue, not just for the dysfunctional families, incidentally, the high-risk ones, but for all of us. How are we going to kind of cope with it? But keeping a diary would be a good idea, and the self-regulation thing that we heard earlier, I think is quite good. And think about, what you should think about is your kids. You should say to yourself, how do I protect the family? And perhaps one of the ways you protect the family when you're forced together, the police aren't around because they're doing other things, right, is to actually, I guess, repress your anger yourself in order to protect the children. Find ways of actually protecting the children in the home. But keeping a diary is one way of, in a way, venting your feelings without it becoming aggressive and leading to reciprocal violence.
Right. That's a message that I hope resonates with many people who are watching this, that it comes down to trying to prioritize your own health during this time, but also realizing that if you are in the power of carrying out abuse, if you are in the power of carrying out something that will harm someone else, then this is the point where you need to understand the entire anxiety of the situation, what's forcing you to do it, and try to take a step back. That's what we can hope would happen for people who are hearing this. Thank you so much, Professor Cary Cooper, for joining us from Manchester and talking to us about this. Now we're joined by Daanika Kamal, who is a human rights lawyer. She also runs an NGO called The Color Blue, which deals with mental health in Pakistan. She joins us from Islamabad. Thank you so much, Daanika, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, you recently wrote an issue about the very topic we're discussing today, which is domestic violence and the rise we're going to see about it all across the world, but also here in our part of the region. You mentioned specifically about how many abusers will take this situation to manipulate others and to play psychological games with the victim. Can you just take us through the ways you fear that's going to happen?
Sure. So I think abuse is all about control. Abusive partners typically like to exert their control on victims by, controlling their environment, their finances, their interactions, and their movements. And I think all of these aspects have been made worse by social isolation. And while the regulations imposed by the government and the recommendations that everyone should stay indoors and practice, social distancing, all of these measures are, of course, absolutely essential to curb the spread of the virus. But it has also provided sort of an easy justification for abusers to exercise these various different forms of control. And so from the stories I received from women in different parts of Pakistan, social isolation has essentially meant that they're unable to meet their friends and family, many of which were part of their emotional support systems. And they've also been unable to go to places that would otherwise, provide them with a sort of sanctuary. So in one example, a woman shared that she had gone out to do groceries, and when she returned, her husband made her wash her face with bleach, saying that she had to do this in order to ensure that she didn't bring the virus home with her to, infect him or the children. So that's an example of how, this has been used as a tool of justification and manipulation. Right. And some stories that I received also reflected the emotional stresses that are coming alongside not being able to, for women not being able to send their children away from the house, in times when these things are happening, which means that more children are also going to be likely witnessing certain acts of abuse in the house. And the women were obviously worried that this is going to have, a detrimental effect on their behaviors and well-being right now, but also especially as they grow older.
No, and that, of course, is something people need to remember, that children absorb what they see in their environment, and that reproduces itself in different forms throughout their life. Either it manifests in trauma or it manifests in mimicking behavior they saw during their childhood. Daanika, now, witnessing everything you've been seeing, the stories you've been getting, and then researching and trying to find options, have you come across any which would work for women within Pakistan who are going through these situations?
So to give you an example, I was actually reading a report a few hours ago of measures that France has taken to provide support to victims of domestic abuse. Even in France during the coronavirus, there have been very high rates of abuse. And what they're doing is essentially they're relocating women who have faced physical abuse specifically at the hands of their partners to hotels. And they've also, and the government is going to be paying for, a certain amount of nights of accommodation at hotels. They have also set up, 20 support centers at in shopping areas. And the other thing they've done, which I think is really nice, is that they've established a code word for women to discreetly say at pharmacies. I think the code word was mask 19. So it's essentially they're going to pharmacies and they say this code word, which will alert pharmacists that they are victims of domestic abuse. In Pakistan, a lot of these options aren't necessarily available, but something that the Ministry of Human Rights has done recently. So they have a helpline which has been operational for a while, but recently they emphasized that victims of domestic abuse should particularly reach out if they are facing, any sort of abuse during social isolation.
Right. Daanika, sorry, but since we're running on time, just one last question to you. Do you feel like social media, especially in a time when we're isolated from everyone around us, can play a positive role in trying to support those who are going through these difficult times?
I think connections are very important, and social media especially allows victims to reach out for assistance, whether it be friends, family, or even strangers for that matter. I think especially when physical options right now are very limited, and for emotional support, I think social media also allows them to reach out anonymously, which is very helpful because there's obviously the fear of culture and family-based repercussions. So I think it plays a big role there.
Right. Thank you so much, Daanika Kamal, for joining Islamabad, shedding light on the ongoing situation and some of the initiatives that governments can take to protect the most vulnerable in this situation. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we take a look at the heat wave in Antarctica. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, the first ever heat wave at a research base in East Antarctica was recorded by scientists. This unprecedented weather in the world's coldest place is going to impact the world. But how exactly? Let's discuss this further. Joining us today is Mr. Svein, who's the former UN Director of Climate Change and CEO of Klima 20, a climate change consultancy. He joins us from Norway. Also joining us today is Professor Peter Newman, who's a professor of sustainability at Cary University and an IPCC author. He joins us from Perth. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Tveitdal, I'd like to begin with you. Now, for many of us who don't understand exactly how different this weather change was than the previous years, when we're talking about the region of Antarctica, break it down for us.
Well, we saw the records that came this year, and I've looked a little bit into the figures. And what happened with these records is that it was actually almost 7 centigrades above the station's mean maximum. So the heating is severe, and you probably also are aware that it's Arctic and Antarctica that are the places on Earth which is heating the fastest. And as an example, when I worked with the UN, I visited Antarctica and I went to Scott's hut, where he was more than 100 years ago, and there was this race between the Norwegian Amundsen and Scott to come to the South Pole. And at that time, that hut was completely frozen, and you could see the sheep hanging there, and everything was like it was more than 100 years ago. But in the last years, I have just read that now, due to the warming, there is more snow, there is more thawing and freezing, so these huts and other cultural heritage sites in Antarctica is deteriorating very fast.
Right. Professor Peter Newman, now these places seem so far away, so isolated from the rest of the world, and we talk about climate change a lot on the show, and it's about what's happening within our own countries and, places that seem to be accessible for the most of us. But how does what is happening in this region impact the world in its entirety?
Well, unprecedented is a word we hear a lot now, isn't it? And eventually unprecedented impacts on all of us, because if you're changing the world so much, it's certainly going to change your own local weather at some point and bring about something like our appalling fires that we had in Australia. But also it's going to change the food production systems. And certainly that's what's happening in the Antarctic area. If it keeps going up like this in temperature, the krill starts to deteriorate, and all the masses of mammal fish life and the whales and so on that are dependent on that are going to also suffer. So the whole food chain begins to collapse. Now that's the ecological scenario that we've heard about as a possibility. Suddenly we look like it's happening.
Right. And it's rather alarming to hear about all of these things happening. And as you say, you hear that word unprecedented again and again, especially it has become almost a regular word used in climate change vocabulary. That's how alarming the entire situation is. Mr. Svein Tveitdal, just continuing with what I asked Professor Newman, how will this impact us in ways we don't really expect it to?
Well, you have of course local impact in Antarctica. A few words about that. Your viewers might have seen this film, The March of the Penguins. That is the emperor penguin. That was very, very popular some years ago. Actually now they have declined by 50%. And they need reliable sea ice for breeding and raising their chicks. And by the end of the century, they might go extinct. In Halley Bay, one particular place in Antarctica, 10,000 chicks drowned in 2016 when the sea ice broke up too early. So you have the local impacts. But then, as the professor talked about, with the warming water and also the melting water, you have global impacts. Of course, you have stronger and stronger contribution to global sea level rise. And the temperature in Antarctica is also driving the global ocean conveyor belt, which is a constant system of deep ocean circulation that transfers oceanic heat around the planet. And
Mr. Tveitdal, that sounds, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that sounds awfully complicated. How do we understand what that exactly does and what that exactly means?
To make it a little bit more easy, when it gets warmer in Antarctica, it has an impact on the ocean streams. Like in the Arctic, that has an impact on the Gulf Stream, and it might actually reduce the Gulf Stream. So one scenario is that it gets colder in Europe due to that. And you have the same mechanisms in Antarctica, actually, and the impact they have on the global ocean streams.
Professor Peter Newman, now this is, of course, going to come into the conversation given the world we are living in right now. But many people are talking about how with the lockdown, we are seeing the air much cleaner, we can breathe better, all these measures. Do you feel like there can be a move towards moving towards real-time measures to reduce our carbon footprint after this pandemic is over?
Well, it certainly is reducing the greenhouse gases and the air pollutants in our atmosphere, and we're breathing better because of it. But the key thing is what happens next. The next economy is going to emerge out of this massive shutdown. And we're starting to see that we can do a lot of things in this next economy now that we hadn't imagined before, because it seemed too hard to change. You know, the economy was such an absolute, and suddenly it's gone. The whole economy is just shutting down. So the use of fossil fuels disappearing. And we have to now say, well, let's build up the next economy without needing these fossil fuels. How can we do this in ways that don't use coal and oil and natural gas in ways that are polluting our future? How can we switch to renewables? And these opportunities, which have been sitting waiting to be used, can now be implemented quickly. They can be our next big projects that help lift the economy out and drive us to a much better future.
So since we're talking about things that I never thought would happen so early on, especially in terms of climate change, the manifestations of it, what do you think, given the pandemic, given the global response by governments all around, are some of the lessons we can learn and perhaps use them when you're saying rebuilding our world altogether after this is over?
Well, I think there are 4 quick things that we've learned. First of all, you can believe in science. See, we've had this constant debate as to whether the science of climate is right or not, and you can take it or leave it. But we're not saying that about the virus. Oh boy, we believe in science because we want to know what to do. And you've got every government standing next to their scientific health officers saying, these people are showing us what to do. So we've got a new sense that government and science can work together much stronger. And well, the scientists have been saying what to do for some time. So we need to believe that. We need to stop all the rumours and falsities and get on with it. The second thing is about this ultimate, the strength of the economy that you can't change. Well, we have changed it. So let's now see that we can change a future, have a new economy and make a bridge to it, and set up a war cabinet, an action plan that we are able to believe in, the same way governments are now setting up these action plans across the world and getting on with it.
Right. Mr. Tveitdal, that is interesting number of measures and points that Professor Peter Newman talked about, the next world order, how governments can deal better, given that now what we're seeing is how the environment impacts the economy, impacts us at such a significant level that it almost shuts the entire world down. What are some of the lessons you feel like can be learned from this?
Well, I think lesson number one is that if we want to do something together, we can do it. Because the war against the coronavirus we see now is also unprecedented. But it shows that if we will and if we want, we can actually also solve climate change. The coronavirus we have now is for a short period. Climate change is for a longer period. That is the challenge. But if we spent a similar amount of money that we now use on this short-term threat, we would be able to reach international agreed global goals, and we would be able to stop warming at least on 2 centigrades. It will still be a problem, but as it is now, we are going towards 3 to 4 degrees, and that is not a crisis, that is a catastrophe.
And I think it's important to remember that many experts have predicted in the past that with climate change, we will see more frequent pandemics. So that is something that you cannot isolate or you cannot just ignore once this pandemic is over, hopefully. And we do move towards trying to take more long-term measures, especially when we're talking about climate change. Thank you so much, Mr. Svein Tveitdal, for joining us, Professor Peter Newman for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.